welcome. Welcome again to this new edition of the Backstage that we had to postpone a couple of times, you know. But finally, we are here talking about Arna. Once you start studying the Arna history, well, you got a very controversial storytelling. There's different elements intertwining. There's the industry, there's politics, there's market issues, technological issues. So, before getting to know the Arna series, the different versions, and all the models, there's a nice story to tell with some interesting times, big mistakes, but all these elements characterize this project. Arna, in the end, was born, and some of them still today are back in the collector's craze, but its history is way deeper and more complex. And as always, in order to tell this story, we asked some people to join us. We have Luciano Colle, which I please ask to come on stage. Please take a seat between the two, Arnaldo. So you are an engineer, right? Yeah, I was responsible for designing the Alfa Romeo engines. And when the company wanted to produce a more economically competitive car, replacing the Alfa Romeo Alfasud, which was quite expensive, we thought of an agreement which was kind of a political agreement. There were several issues, but Nissan was chosen, and the first contacts were taken in 1980. So, the design department, since the agreement said that the Nissan should provide the chassis and the back suspensions of the car, so all the other components, the mechanical elements of the cars, were Alfa Romeo, Alfasud. So we did the first installation studies, where to position the engine, etc. We had meetings with the Japanese to define how to assemble the various parts on the chassis and the first cars. So the light. So the kind of engines to be installed was defined. That's why we thought about the small 1200 engine and then a 1350 engine, a little bit more powerful. So the first tests started without problems. There were meetings with the Japanese technicians. So all went kind of smoothly. There were no big obstacles. So just in terms of experiments, the testing and the experimentation was not my responsibility, but my colleagues. Unfortunately, they're not here. I wanted to bring one colleague who's 96 now, but he could not be here with us today. But the only problem that came out was that once the car was assembled, at the tests, there was an oversteering issue. So we tried to look for this problem of oversteering of the car. And in the checks, we identified the problem which was linked to the back suspension, which is a triangle suspension, which had this oversteering effect on the tires. So the only change which was made was to lower 20 millimeters the triangle of the suspension at the summit, and everything was fixed, and then we had no more problems in terms of reliability of the car when driving. So we continued, and in 1980 things went smooth, as I said, and you all know that in 1983 the car started to be produced. In the beginning, but let's not finish the backstage immediately. Let's get there little by little. So the other two people who contributed are not here. We will see them remotely, and then they are not here live. But there's Mr. Oka, who was market director of Nissan in Europe, and Mr. Ayata, who's a journalist of Car Graphic, a Japanese magazine, who was the first in 2008 to write a report on the Arna, this magazine, on a magazine called Solo Alfa in Japanese, and he helped us a lot relaunching the Arna. But the person that I have to thank to put me in contact with these two people and helping me solve many problems is Yuko. Yuko knows everyone, and everyone knows Yuko, but I defined her with what Mr. Ayata introduced her. He said, and if there's a Japanese who wants to do research on Alfa or Italian cars, has to call Yuko. So this is enough to define a person. So thanks a lot, Yuko. So all starts with the Piano Alfa 80. What was it? It was a 5-year plan that Alfa Romeo launched around 1976 to solve the problems of the automobile producer and widen its horizons. So they wanted to reorganize the range in a very simple way. While in the previous years the Alfa Romeo had few models declined in different versions, they thought that the market, the automobile market of the 80s, should have required a different setting, so a different model for each segment. So there was the Alfasud and the Alfetta, but there was a gap between the two. But there was no cheap range. There was no entry-level car for the Alfa Romeo range. So they started to investigate the collaboration with another foreign car dealer. Foreign was almost compulsory at the time in Italy in order to have an agreement and give light to a car that could satisfy all these factors. Specifically, they looked at Japan because at the time there were several brands that were already working well on the North American market and that had some problems but wanted to launch their cars on the European market. So now I leave the floor to Mr. Ayata, who tells what was the choice of Nissan. Well, if Alfa Romeo had to choose an important company, well, it just had to be Nissan because Toyota already worked with Ford. Honda had other agreements, so the only free one, I would say, was Nissan. And then Alfa Romeo had the Alfasud, the Alfetta, but between the Alfasud and the Alfetta, there was a missing segment. And for this reason, Alfa Romeo was thinking of creating another segment between Alfetta and Alfasud. That's why they started to talk with Nissan. Well, in reality, the agreement then didn't go in that direction, but on the contrary, they thought of raising the Alfasud segment and the 33. As a matter of fact, would have been, even though in the same segment, for size and for the structure it was based on, increase the segment, almost overlapping with the upper segment, the average sedans. So by freeing space for a smaller car than Alfasud, but not so small, which would have been the Arna. What instead the Alfa Romeo starts to understand since the beginning is that there could be political obstacles and market obstacles seeing a Japanese dealer entering Italy. And we will see that in a bit. So one of the first surveys didn't include Nissan, but another dealer, a dealer which had plants in Spain, but in those years was having a commercial deal with Nissan, so they thought of having a partnership with Nissan with another European dealer. So they stated that this Iberian dealer was not reliable financially, but then in the end they started to contact. So I mean, it was Alfa Romeo who went to knock on the door of Nissan to propose this agreement. So everything starts with a kind of quick timeline. So the first contact, at least in-person contact, is an invitation to go to Balocco. So to Balocco, the Nissan managers tried the Alfasud, then they tried the race cars, they saw the cars that the Alfa Romeo was producing at the time, and they started to understand the worth and the values of Alfa Romeo. After some time, there was another visit, so Italians went to Japan, so there was a delegation going to Tokyo to understand what could be made to create the Arna. A little time went by, so a couple of months between the meetings, and in September 1979, a memorandum was done, so a draft of agreement, which was then confirmed with a longer visit in Pomigliano d'Arco, where they went to see the mechanical groups, the production capacities, and the industrial situation of Alfa Romeo at that time. And then there were, again, 2 more visits where this agreement, which was drafted in September 1979, was then fine-tuned till 18th of December 1980, which sees the act that creates the Arna and the Nissan automobiles. So the agreement was 50%, so both paid 12.5 billion liras of the time, and the company starts to be built with 2 fundamental data. The headquarters, which are in Naples, so not yet in Varese or in Roma, and a 10 years time limit, and then it was postponed by 3 years, already in 1983 when the car was presented, because that was the time the car required for being produced. And the definition of a new company is to create and manage a plant in the south of Italy to build vehicles and parts and their distribution and marketing in Italy and abroad. So one of the fundamental elements is that Arna had to have its plant independent from the Pomigliano one and independent from the rest of the Alfa Romeo network. And this was something that still today the partners thought was a political matter, not having to do with the industrial reasons. So in the Pomigliano plant, and its saturation, one of the main problems. Well, Nissan had 2 powers. One is the president, and the other the trade unions. So the trade unions were very strong in Japan, and the head of the trade unions wanted to go to America. Mr. Shioji was at the head of Nissan's trade unions, and President Ichihara was the real president. So there were two different powers. So Ishihara said, okay, we're going to work in Europe. So the story is very interesting. This was, Lorenzo, a very interesting project for the president, but he didn't want to let this project be disclosed to the trade unions. That's why they were working almost hiding. No one knew about this project. So in 1979, March, April was the offer from Alfa Romeo. And after 3-4 months, the project started to launch, because it was not a huge product and they wanted to do that quickly. But Shioji didn't have to be informed. So Ayata told me that when the delegation of Italians went to Japan, they could not go and visit the Nissan factory. They always had to do the meetings in the hotel. So the Italians didn't know the Nissan factory. So the meetings were always at a hotel. There was a small hotel room to discuss. And that's how it started. Shioji didn't know anything. So there were some political tensions, not only from the Italian part, but also from the Japanese part, which considered the arrival on the Italian market something very important for the future of the company. So the vision of this agreement was kind of different. So Italy and Japan had two different views, and this emerges easily the day of the inauguration of Prato La Serra plant. You see here part of the speech of Nissan president, whose Japanese name I don't want to try to say, which talks about not about an agreement, but of an Alfa Romeo interested in selling a Nissan model with the goal of reducing costs, as if the entire production of Arna in Italy were almost a licensing agreement. So anyway, we are here at the inauguration of the Prato La Serra plant, which was chosen for many reasons. Many were political reasons, but it had to comply with certain requirements that both Alfa Romeo and Nissan gave. First of all, around 100 pages were drawn saying how the plant had to be realized, because Arna had to be built trying to remain as faithful as possible to the building methods of Nissan. The Prato La Serra plant was planned before starting. A delegation of Nissan was brought to visit the area on which the plant would be built, and the anomaly was explained, the anomaly of Prato La Serra, so the distance between Alfasud in Pomigliano and the Arna plant. So they had to stay within 50 kilometers. There should have been a quick communication road between the two plants to reduce the inefficiencies, and so this new plant was built, partly with the help of local administration, which creates a consortium which deals with expropriations of the land and talks one-to-one with Alfa Romeo. So without interacting with the individual owners. Of course, it was difficult to explain to the partner company the reason of this choice, especially because in the beginning, the idea was to saturate the production capacity of Alfasud, and the explanation that was given to Nissan, and we hear the words of Mr. Oka, is the one that we all hear. So that's what he understood. For the Arna project, the object was the Pomigliano plant. Had to do some parts, but also in the south of Italy, were required jobs. So it was a political decision to create job places in the south of Italy. So the plant, in any way, was built, was well built, and will start production. What was not built in time, but that was done with Alfasud before, or what was not done was a correct training for the staff. So staff were brought from Pomigliano and Avellino partly, but were also supervised in Prato la Serra of a small delegation, a couple of persons from Nissan. So everything was ready, and then we get to the day of the inauguration of the plant. It was an inauguration to which also Pertini, the Italian President of the Republic, took part. There were people of the managers from Alfa Romeo and Nissan and political leaders. So everything was ready to start the production. So in the different speeches, basically, they told that everything should have been based on a big space where all these boxes and containers coming from Japan would arrive. And that's true. You see, there are pictures that show a construction process which was not linear because, okay, the first logistical aspect is the through the sea and through ships, the material arrived from Japan, and then the chassis were created in Pomigliano and then sent to Prato la Serra. So a series of special vehicles were created, so trucks, specific trucks, or the chassis going back and forth from Pomigliano were loaded. But the production was not robotized, automatized as expected. In the same year when the Arna was presented, also the Alfa 33 was presented, and there were the first intelligent robots introduced. They started talking about the possibility of reducing the human presence, but for Arna, they took a step backwards and kept manual all the processes. So the project of a car starts. It is, yes, a carryover of Nissan, but it requires, as Colle said, a series of meetings with the technicians. The first of these meetings, which was recorded, was in Balocco. So probably the first that we saw in 1979, where there is a delegation of Japanese meeting a delegation of the different departments of Alfasud and Alfa Romeo, so they start to talk about this project. At that point, some problems were born, and Alfa Romeo was obliged to issue a technical dictionary from Italian to Japanese so that the designers and technicians could somehow understand what was written on the drawings. So we know that Alfa Romeo published technical drawings autonomously starting from the 20s, but in general these were towards German, French, Spanish. I doubt that for an Italian it would have been so easy to read Japanese terms on the drawings. But anyway, this dictionary is the proof of the difference of communication, which was very strong at the beginning of the project. So the person responsible of the project from Nissan was Mr. Chino, that was already quoted a couple of times and would have been interviewed by Mr. Ayata and would explain the main difficulties of this collaboration. So, first of all, the starting point. The starting point was a car which had wanted to become the most sold car of its time. It was sold with a Pulsar Sunny Cherry name by Nissan on Asian markets and with the name Langley. And it is this exact version which is the starting point of the Arna. There were no big differences between this and the other. They had more or less all the same shape, but the variant which was chosen as the starting point was this. And then the main elements started to be outlined, so to divide what should come from Japan and what should be built by Alfasud, with a third category. So an Arna production, that is a series of production of materials produced by Arna or other suppliers hired by them. So there was a scheme like you do this, I do this will be built in the plant. So rapidly, there was a different scheme indicating the production flow. So when the materials arrive, how they interact between them, how they are built, etc. But if we go even deeper, we get to a specification of all the components, which are divided in three packages. The Nissan package, which is materials produced and sent in this CKD, so disassembled but not complete, and which include a series of components, the main ones, but also some minor components that go and travel together with the main components. Then we have a second Alfa Romeo package. Actually, it was Alfasud package, so everything coming from the Pomigliano plant or from suppliers directly connected with Alfasud. And then we have a third package, which is the Arna one. That is everything which is produced directly by the plant, or which is a specific production, which is not falling in Nissan's responsibility nor in Alfa Romeo's responsibility. So at this point, in the definition of the project, at least from the design point of view, as Colle said, everything went smooth, the car was working, okay, yes, there were problems of understanding, but in both interviews, it is underlined that even though with different mindsets, the climate was cool in the evening between the different technicians from Alfa and Nissan, so it went quite smooth. But a couple of elements were underlined from both sides of design, I mean both Italian technicians and Japanese technicians. One is the characteristic angles, the other one is ventilation. So one of the big steps that Arna brings on the Italian market, on the Alfa Romeo market, is the fact that Arna is the first Alfa Romeo car with an effective ventilation system. While the internal ventilation in the previous years in the Alfa cars were almost an optional, for Arna it was different, it was very effective. There was the recirculation of air that on Alfa Romeo would have been a reality only with the 33, which was, so to speak, a children of the Arna. The other point, which is a recurrent one, is the characteristic angles that Colle started to say something about, but also that Chino continues to stress. So the camber, the inclination of the tire compared to the lens. So the Nissan Cherry or the Pulsar, the Langley, the Sunny, or whatever you want to name it, had a 1 degree camber. And the Japanese technicians, by bringing the designs of this project, they said it has to be 1 degree. But the Alfa Romeo technicians, on the contrary, tried the car. They realized that the behavior was not the behavior expected from an Alfa Romeo, and so they wanted to have a 3 degree camber. This was a surprise for Mr. Chino, and so the group of designers, through him, that in the beginning were surprised of how Alfa Romeo was against this, because in their eyes the car was working perfectly. But at one point it also became a very appreciated element. I mean, in the group of technicians from Nissan, the idea started to spread that Alfa Romeo knew what they were doing, and that this point against this inclination was the result of a good analysis carried out on a project, even though this had nothing to do with the organization of works, quality of production, etc. So the project, anyway, was brought forward and completed, and in 1983 the car was ready to be produced. The Arna is the Arna that we all know, and it was initially presented as all the other Alfa Romeo. So they published, these schemes and information materials, but there was something different compared to the other Alfa Romeo at the moment, because the communication campaign was kind of bizarre. They started to use play on words. Arnaldo the Leopard was also born. So not always these slogans, these claims, which were informal, were appreciated. So for some were too ironic. So it also became a synonymous to define what later would be a failure of the project. So Alfa Romeo started to use this a fun tone towards the audience, but also internally. So this is what was called the launch guide for all the other cars, but with Arna had a more provocatory approach. But before the launch, there were things written not only by Alfa Romeo but also by others, and this is the press review of Arna. So on one side it is a new car that falls in the will of Alfa Romeo to relaunch the brand, to increase the production volumes. Alfa Romeo heralds that between the Arna and the 33 they would have produced 180,000 cars per year, but they would never get close to those figures. But that was what was written in the press release, and the reactions came quickly. So while from abroad people talk about the new project, market ambitions, and other automobile aspects, in Italy there was the idea of the Japanese invasion on the Italian market that started to take place, and the other dealers didn't like this. Not only Italian car dealers, actually. So there were pushes and lobbies on the governments, etc. So the Arna, anyway, continued its design with the different range, but today we don't have the time to talk about the range of the Arna. We had the basic versions, the versions with options, the very rare T. We are lucky enough to have a car here with us of that version today. but there would also be many other ideas that saw in the Arna the starting point for a series of variants like coupe, spiders, sedans, but also specialized cars like the prototype of a small van which were not only drafted but they were also realized in terms of prototypes from external producers. But having adapted the Alfasud mechanics to the chassis of the Nissan Pulsar or Cherry implied a series of modifications. So my question is, were there also modifications from the mechanical point of view, or it was only a problem of small differences in settings? Well, there was an adjustment of needs. I mean, the chassis had to be adapted to the attach points, for example, of the engine, but very, very simple. So there were no big specific interventions to adapt the mechanics of Alfa Romeo to a Nissan. That was very limited. So there was not a big problem in that. And the engines were designed from the start. Well, the engines were exactly transferred from the Alfasud production, which at the moment was evolving to the 33, on the Nissan. So they were unchanged, the engines. But what is something to clarify is the price thing. So let's do something. If we took the lira and yen exchange rate from the half of the 70s till the half of the 80s, we discovered that that was the worst moment to make an agreement. So yen remains fundamentally stable from 1975 to 1978, and in 1978 it starts its depreciation. So for Alfa Romeo, it was a big opportunity. There was a trend of depreciations in the yen, so it would have been financially okay to bring stuff from Japan, also compensating the transport cost. But the month when the agreement was signed and the Arna was founded, the yen inverses its trends and starts its appreciation, and its evaluation would come to 1983 when yen was 5 times what it was worth when the contract was thought. Yeah, the problem was that with Nissan, they managed to have the costs of the chassis way lower than the production of Alfa Romeo. But then this change of trend of the yen didn't allow this advantage to be exploited. So you see, there were people who talked about the Japanese interference, but people said, yes, but we save money. Then in the end, the yen created this crisis, and we know the problems after 83. Well, these problems that on the Italian market were dampened by a series of elements, like the state property of state ownership of Alfa Romeo at the time, were very strong when they wanted to create a price for the foreign market. The foreign market initially had to be organized in different countries, but they started to use as a test market what was more liberal, free at the moment, the English market, where Nissan already worked with other brands, in collaboration with other brands, and there were no fiscal obstacles to the import of foreign cars. So it looked to be the ideal place, and it was also a market where the Cherry, the entire Cherry with Nissan chassis and engine, was already sold. At the time, the European markets of Nissan were managed by a central headquarters placed in Brussels, and Mr. Oka, that we interviewed, who we interviewed was working in Brussels. When he was told, move to Italy because there's an office ready for you, a commercial office that will uh, manage Europe. Well, Mr. Oka arrived in Italy. There was no office ready. He had to do what he could, and thanks to the support of some colleagues from Alfa Romeo, he was given an office here. He was given a secretary speaking English, Adriana. If someone knows her, well, Mr. Oka would be happy to thank her for the support he received 40 years ago. But we still have to understand at what price and in which positioning to sell the Cherry Europe, which is the non-Italian version of the Arna, on the markets where the normal Cherry was already present with the Nissan engine. And Mr. Oka gives his point of views. Okay, we are in the 80s. The Japanese automobiles were selling good on the American market. And why? Because on the American market there were very big cars, while with the Japanese cars, which were smaller, there was a market. While in Europe, small cars were already sold, like Toyota and Nissan, for example. So it was very difficult to penetrate the European market. So, to fight and enter the European market, they had to lower the price to compete with the small European cars. But that was not enough. So why it was very difficult? Because Europe was already selling the Cherry, right? And in order to sell the Arna, they thought, okay, there's no sports version of the Cherry, so they thought of having a sports version. But it was very difficult to set a price because Cherry had a standard price. And in order to create this sports part as Cherry Europe, it was very difficult to decide a price. Because if it were too expensive, they could not have sold the car. But it could not be too low. So the different production inefficiencies of Alfa Romeo and of the Arna in general caused a high production price. Then there was the yen, which was growing. So on the foreign markets, that was the problem. So positioning the Arna a little bit higher than the Cherry with the sports version was a way to do that, but the ambitions were very high because starting from the beginning of the Arna project, they thought of producing 60,000 per year, 30,000 for the Italian market with the Arna name, and 30 more thousand for the different foreign markets with the Cherry Europe brand. So these figures were not free, but it was like compulsory because there were countries, we will see, that had norms on the import, fixing a threshold on the number of cars to be imported, and the number of 38,000 corresponded to that threshold. So the problem was that when the first lot of 700 Cherry Europe was sent to the United Kingdom, the first big problem of quality arose. So initially, they wanted to sell 30,000 cars, 30,000. But they just produced 700 cars. That's it. They sold 700. The price it was 20-30% higher than the normal Nissan Cherry. So it was a disaster, only 700. And the reason is that the first car that arrived in England well, didn't have a high quality. So the quality of the construction was not good. So this Cherry Europe arrived in England. So the next day, Oka was called. They said, Oka, it's incredible. 80% of these cars do, do not work well. You have to come here immediately to England. So 80% of the cars were not working well. For Nissan in Japan, it was something unthinkable of. So for example, the window was opening like this, but once opened, it could not be closed. In Japan, that was impossible. So these things could not happen. But building in Italy, many things like that happened. So quality was not good of these first 700 cars. So when you push the brakes, the light went on, for example. You wanted to open the hood, and it was not possible all the time. For Japanese people, it was incredible. For example, he understands very well this because on the dashboard there's a clock, right? So the clock had 12 at the top and 6 at the bottom usually, no? But 50% of the cars had it mounted the other way around. So he sent communication of this, that the quality was very bad. Said, so we have to check and have the best quality, but in order to do this, there was a big problem. So the Arna plant, so in Avellino there were 2 Japanese people with the Japanese mindset of high quality. So they could check, but in Pomigliano d'Arco there were no Japanese people. So for Austria and Portugal, there was a presentation of cars. But having had this bad reputation of Cherry Europe in England, they didn't want those cars. So it could not be sold in Germany. But the French market was very big. So they could go on the French market, but Alfa Romeo said no, that they could not go to the French market to sell these cars. So there were problems in construction quality, not only in absolute terms, because probably in the first lot, okay, there could be some mistakes, but Nissan's technicians also saw a difficulty of management of production flows, so that a car which was thought with a production system, a quality control system, and a different organization was then built in a new plant with staff that was not thoroughly trained and not organized, with the same procedures that were applied to the initial model. At the time, Japan was at the cutting edge in the organization of production, and especially in quality control, and that was one of the main elements that brought the European cars in Europe and in North America. That's why they were successful on these markets, and that's why some markets fear the arrival of the Japanese. So, what, from the point of view of Mr. Oka, was responsible for sales, and it was in a difficult position at the time in having to sell a car that was too expensive and not of the quality that they were expecting, and it's his managers that were pushing, because when you don't sell a car, the problem is always the problem of those who sell it, and you need some time to explain that the problem was a broader system which was not perfectly defined. So the problem was not a problem of the uh, project or the plant, but of discrepancy between what was expected and what was really happening. So maybe the Italians thought that with the Japanese car they could have a good price with a reasonable quality. But in order to build a Japanese car, what is important is to have a Japanese mindset. You need a lot of time. You want to have high quality. You want to lower the price, so to be quick, but not having this Japanese organization and mindset, maybe it is difficult to have the quality of the Japanese cars. You cannot shorten that, you cannot have shortcuts. So one of the main problems that was identified was a problem of organization of production flows, but also organization of the market. And this appears, for example, in the lack of a correct market survey on the product. So when Mr. Oka has to sell the Cherry Europe on the English market, okay, there were problems of quality and price, but there was also the problem having a product which was not thought and defined for that market. Also, from the point of view of the basic elements and options, well, so before ordering the car, they did a survey in England, but in Pomigliano they did 5 colors. The Italian said, okay, let's do 5 colors, maybe 20, 20, 20, so 20% each color, but without doing survey. So it's very difficult. They didn't organize focus groups or market research to understand what the customers wanted. So he thinks that in order to sell well the Arna, the organization should have been redone completely, because there was a lack of organization. So if there's no perfect organization, many issues then come up. But if you can reorganize everything, things can go well, but you need time and you need money. What was an organizational problem was the mirror of a cultural difference, a difference of approach between the Italian industry and the Japanese industry. We've seen before, talking about the camber angle and performance on the road, that there was good respect, mutual respect, but we're talking about a historical brand like Alfa Romeo based on big values, but which needed to learn something and to be restructured from the organizational point of view. And on the other side, we had the Japanese brand that, like the other Japanese brands, was also thinking about new production systems, new design system to make more and more efficient the market and the car production. So there's 2 types of construction of cars in Japan and Italy, very different. In Japan, before building the car, there's a big structure, and then there's many suppliers, many suppliers who put their heart in what they do, to do something very good at a low price. Because everyone wants to build a good car with high quality, but not with a high price. So not to make money. Everyone wanted to help build the car. This is the Japanese mindset. So the structure is very important, while in Italy it is very different. But in reality, what was a consequence was also caused by the intention to make the Prato la Serra plant not completely inefficient for the other function, which was to create job places and increase the number of workers. And that is also clear already from the protocol of intent of the 5-year plan, where the main points of the Arna and the plant and the project were defined. And this document underlines, it was the beginning of the 80s, that the decision was to increase the number of staff, even where it was not necessary, or there could have been more automation and there could have been a more efficient construction process. Okay, this document then passed on several desks and was defined as positive, the craftsmanship, the contribution, but something behind it. It was not only industrial logic, but was also social and political. So we've seen that the experience of the Arna on the European markets is abruptly interrupted. So the test market was the United Kingdom. It was the most liberal one, and then it originated to a failure. Mr. Oka talked about this like suffering. It looked like in an awkward position, because being a professional, it was a failure, even though it was not his fault. But that was a test. It was decided not to go on the other markets that had been studied, like the French, the Spanish, and the Austrian one, and they had to also come before the German market. This would not happen. The market would have been a reduced market. And no one would know nothing about the Arna or the Cherry Europe, almost. But in Italy, the 60,000 number was not reached, but the Arna was selling a little. In the beginning, it was warmly welcomed, and there were difficulties, mainly linked to the design, which was clearly different from what the Alfa Romeo offered to its fans, but the commercial office recorded that there was few options. So the Arna was cheap, but not so cheap, and so there were not many options in it. So they tried to update it with richer versions, but clearly the project partly was compromised. So the question is, what happened of the Arna in Japan? We've seen in Italy that before starting the project of the Arna itself, there were a series of political difficulties, a tug of war between the company and the trade unions, which are very strong in the Japanese companies, political problems linked to the import and export duties, volumes, limits, thresholds, etc. But the main version of the Pulsar is a car that Nissan itself, for the Japanese market, communicates together with Alfa Romeo. As you can see in this picture of this commercial leaflet of the high-range Pulsar was shot in Milan, in Piazza Duomo, with the cars of the Alfa Romeo Museum in the background, together with some of the managers of Nissan. So this version had a chassis which was the same of the Arna, but recall the Arna TI also inside. It had the same seats with the green element, and on the leaflet, the collaboration between Nissan and Alfa Romeo was communicated. So the Arna was never marketed in Japan, neither like Arna nor like Cherry Europe. And as Mr. Ayata said during the interview, the project remained for years undercover. Everyone lost track of it. It was his article as journalist of Car Graphic and then also Alfa to light the interest for this model, which is an interesting piece of the Alfa Romeo history, but also of Nissan's history. At one point, people started to talk about this car, and today there are also some, even though rare, imports, like imports of Italian Arna, which are owned by Japanese collectors. So Arna is standardized in Japan. There's a dealer in Japan now which is selling another Arna. So at the moment there's two Arna currently. Imported from Italy, you mean? Yes, imported from Italy to Japan. There's two. And the cost is 20,000 euros. So now, don't think of selling all your Arnas, sending them to Japan, but after years, well, the recognition of a small chapter of history brings also to a market which is defined by the market and the offer. There's zero offer there, so the demand is always higher in Japan for this car. But the point is that the Arna was based on a 10-year plan. So apart from the Arna that we've seen, that we have in front of us, they thought about the future. But already at the end of 1984, so after not even a year of production, they started to talk about the second generation Arna. And of course, there were two schools of thoughts. One was to base the second generation of the Arna on the second generation of the Cherry Europe, which in the meantime had been presented and marketed, well, the Cherry, on the other markets. But this would have meant to change the production plant, redo the design, the organization, and the guarantee for success was not guaranteed. So the trend of the yen growing already took away the big financial gain from this agreement. So the second variant, the Cressoni one, took place. So they wanted to reinterpret the Arna with minor stylistic interventions. So the internal part, the fenders, so everything that would not have changed the import of chassis without too many impactful changes. But the definition of the project is just the tip of the iceberg, because the real challenge of the Arna second generation was to review the agreements with Nissan. Nissan insisted a lot to have a quota of 50% of the Arna company, but at that quota of 50% of capital corresponded a minimum part, which was 4% of the company of the business risk, because everything was built in Italy. The market was based on the Italian distribution or European distribution linked to Alfa Romeo. So basically, the contribution of Nissan was limited to supplying the chassis and giving the license to assemble those chassis. So the Alfa Romeo proposes a Nissan to review the agreement to slightly increase the royalties on the shape and the import of the steel sheets, but to reduce to 16 and then to 6% the corporate participation. So making Arna a company strongly controlled by Alfa Romeo. That would have been the basis for the Alfa Romeo to manage the project according to its needs and not based on an agreement which proved to be ineffective. Of course, well, that famous Revisione Cressoni took life in a prototype with lots of innovations that were also introduced by the Alfa 33, even though the shape of the chassis is the Arna, okay, the headlamps and other parts were slightly changed, but in reality we know that this second version of the Arna, which should have arrived up to the 90s, so the second 5 years of the plan, would never see the light, because in the meantime Alfa Romeo 1 year later would have passed into the hands of the Fiat Group, and the Arna project would have been interrupted. The Arna, reviewed by the design department of Alfa Romeo, head by Cressoni at the time, was more pleasant, even though the line of the chassis was similar to the previous one, so not perfectly fit to the new shapes of those years. But the real point was not, and that problem was also a problem of Fiat that would acquire a company, was not what to do with Arna, but what to do with Prato la Serra, because the plant of Prato la Serra, over the years, started to build also other components for the Spider and for the 75, especially electric cables and some other small parts. But this was not enough to maintain the plant open. So the idea was to saturate it with a new project which would have benefited from a collaboration between Alfasud and Nissan on a completely different segment, still new for the European and Italian market, but which looked very promising, which is light all-terrain vehicles, which effectively in the 80s were very fashionable, also thanks to other Japanese car dealers and builders. So the Alfa Romeo already started the R148 Magnaghina from Bruno Magnaghi, who followed the project, whose military version was studied. Probably you saw the prototype in the collection of the museum. But another version, or a series of civil versions, were also conceived, destined to saturate the market, which was strongly growing, of the light all-terrain vehicles, which were kind of also urban, even though, you see, having specific peculiarities. So the 148, well, apparently there was a name, could have had a market that, starting from 10,000 cars, could have grown to levels similar to those estimated for the Arna sedan. But in reality, the project, which was in an advanced stage in terms of design, mechanics, etc., would then be interrupted. The two prototypes built, the red one and the yellow one, were lost, so no one knows where they are. And the Prato La Serra plant, which was now included in a bigger group, would be destined to other uses, and we know would become a hub for engines. But what happens to the company of Arna is something different, because Arna, we know, was a company made 50% by Alfa Romeo Capitals, and for the other 50% from Nissan. So when the Alfa Romeo was acquired by Fiat, there was still that part of Nissan which still had to be allocated because it was not recapitalized. But again, things were sold with the acquisition of 100% of the company, which would go in the Alfa Lancia Industriale. The company of the Fiat holding that for some years managed Alfa Romeo and Lancia before putting everything together, and also Arna, as a company, became part of the Alfa Lancia Industriale. So Alfa Romeo rebuys the half of Nissan. But the conclusion of this history has to do with the so-called pericolo giallo, the yellow danger. So Fiat was against. It is true there were pressures also on governmental level. There were press releases. The Fiat didn't want an agreement between Alfa Romeo and Nissan, not only because they were against, of course, Alfa Romeo, they were competitors, but because they wanted to avoid the risk of having a real invasion on the Italian market of Japanese automobile producers. What was not known in Italy but was known in Japan is that these thresholds were already present, because in the car graphic issue of 1983, when the Arna was presented, when Mr. Ayata sees for the first time the Arna article and gets passionate about the model, well, the agreement was presented in a clearer way. So it was explained how the Arna could be used to bypass the limits on import, because, and at the times, at the beginning of the 80s, for some countries were very strict. In France, you could not import cars from Japan for a quota which was higher than 3%. So only 3%. In Italy, it was worse. You could just import 1% of the cars. So the value of 60,000 cars were given by that threshold. It was not a limitation of the market, like I don't want it, or a production limitation, I cannot produce it, but by the fact that 30,000 was the limit of sales that could be made on the Italian market based on these percentages, and the other 30,000 were estimated, keeping into account the limitations on the other European markets. So the Arna could bypass also these limitations, also in part, due to the fact that, at least on paper, it was a made-in-Italy product, because 80% of the components, but also the plant itself, was residing in Italy. So the car could be defined a made-in-Italy product. So what is the conclusion? Well, yes, there was a strong media pressure on the yellow danger, but it was also not something not true, but it was very clear for Nissan. Yeah, Nissan knew that Italy could import only 1% of cars from Japan, but by working with Alfa Romeo, they could do a made in Italy, so they could penetrate the Italian market. So when I started this project, everyone had high hopes for this Arna. So I'm really sorry about the final result. But he also talked with the Arna responsible in Rome, and I said, this project went very bad, but we learned that the Italian market is very interesting, very fascinating. So Nissan has to create a sales network to sell Nissan cars because the market could be interesting. And that Nissan started to have plants in England. Then they created a Micra, and then they created the Nissan sales network. So he thinks that the Arna project then continued in the other Nissan projects. So the Arna project was a failure, but Nissan learned a lot and could understand very well the Italian market with this experience. And then they could apply this experience for the future of Nissan. So according to him, Nissan learned a lot from that project. So in the end, what happens? Okay, the Japanese car producers were feared in Europe, but we know that the Alfa wanted to saturate the Pomigliano plant. That was not done. And they wanted to learn a production method, but that was not also done. So Nissan had sort of a Trojan horse to penetrate the Italian market, and European. In doing that, sells chassis that were produced in very high numbers in Japan and sells them also in Italy at a cost which becomes more and more interesting because the yen grew value, so they find the strategies, the dealers to penetrate the market, and at the end of this, the Alfa Lancia Industriale then rebuilds the part. So the winners and the losers can easily be understood also by yourself. So I thank Colle, who was kind enough to come with us, Mr. Oka and Mr. Ayata, who gave the availability of their time, and especially I thank Yuko. Yuko didn't want to come on stage, but you were great, so please come here. Thank you. Thanks a lot. In 2008, with the Japanese magazine, when we decided to do this article about the Arna, I asked to the Alfa Romeo people something. I said, we want to do this Arna project. And everyone said, no, it's impossible. Arna is an ugly car. We don't want this to be famous in Japan. Everyone said that. Then in the end, we found someone, Pasquale, who loves the Alfa Romeo. It's Pasquale, right? Then Pasquale introduced me to many people. And then I wrote some things. And in Japan, now they are getting to do the Arna car. And it's selling for 25,000 euros lately. But you don't have to think about selling your car. You have to keep the cars in Italy. And then all the Japanese people who work in Italy say it's hard to work with Italians. I also, when working in Italy, it's difficult because the mindset is completely different. But everyone said Italian life is wonderful. So they want to come back to Italy. All the Japanese say this. So thank you. Thank you, Italy. I love Italy. And then One last thing. This backstage is very well made. But when I spoke with Lorenzo, I said, "What are you organizing?" I said, "We still don't know. We're thinking about it." One week ago. But in Japan, we need to organize these things 2 months in advance. 2 months before, we have to know everything. But also, this is an Italian way of working, which is very different, but it's nice. Well, 2 months ago, we were talking about two backstages ago. Well, it's different as a mindset, but it's very fun, and I love Italy. Thank you. Thank you, Yuko. And of course, thanks to the audience of fans, we've done more than 40 backstages. We started with the Alfa 6, now we are the Arna, so no one was left behind. Thank you very much.